In this part of the tutorial, we're going to do the fun stuff. So this is implementing the main part of the app functionality. So before we just had the nice layout and we've called the button handlers, but we don't have anything happening. This is where we change that. So, and we're doing this because it's important to have the app do more than just look nice. We need it to actually do something, and it's a good chance to understand the difference between the iOS and Android flow. So specifically, we're going to implement the button handlers and the calculate and print functions, and then have them all call each other so that when the button is pressed, the total cost is calculated and printed out. Now this is a part where we get to actually add some functionality to our app, because right now we have a decent looking thing. We have the input known. For example, we know there's going to be cost, we know it's going to be tip. This is going to be the calculate button, that's going to be the final cost, and we've added the button handler, but it still has no functionality yet, so that's what we'll do now. So in this button calculate underscore touch up inside function, I have pretty much all of the button handlers and what will happen. However, I don't necessarily want that inside of this function. I'm going to create another one just to help organize things a little bit. This one is going to be a void, and I'm going to call this call button. So I want this function to actually perform the operations that are going to happen once the button is called. So this call button is going to be called by button calculate underscore touch up inside, and we're going to take all of this code. I know we moved it in here in the previous video, but that was more so just to clear up this space and show you what that looked like. And I'm just going to cut it, and I'm going to call that in call button. So right now, button calculate is going to call the function call button, and that's all it's going to do. So this is just a handler. The button calculate underscore touch up inside is just a handler. For every button that you add in iOS, you'll need this kind of a function, this handler. It will be the name of the button underscore touch up inside. Alright, so now let's add some button functionality. So this will leave as is, this accessibility identifier. That's not really affecting anything. So now this particular line here, this button calculate.touch up inside, this is what will actually happen once the button is pressed. So what do we want this to do? Well, let's do a very similar thing that we did in the Android development. Why don't we make a function that actually does the calculations, and then we'll call it in the call button. So that once a button is pressed, it will call that calculate function, and that function will perform all the calculations. So again, we could honestly jam this all into one big function, but that makes the code hard to read, and I think it's just messy in general, just a bad practice. So what we're going to do is we're going to design a function. Let's call it calculate cost, and we're going to call it in here. So we're just going to call calculate cost function in here, and let's go ahead. I know it's in red because we haven't implemented it or even declared it yet. So let's do that now. So this is going to be another void. Notice all these functions are voids because they're not returning anything. They're only performing some kind of an operation, but again, no return. So this is the function calculate cost, and here we can actually implement some kind of functionality. Now, how do we calculate the cost? Well, in fact, let's call this calculate total cost. The more specific, the better. Now, how do we calculate the cost? Well, we need to first take in our two inputs, which will be our cost and the tip amount that we want to give, or rather the tip percentage. So let's go ahead and create some variables now. So this will be a float, and this will be the cost. And the reason, again, these are floats are because they'll be decimal numbers. If they were integers, then they couldn't have any of the decimals, so we'll leave them as floats. And we don't need the precision of a double. So we'll say float cost is, and just like with Android, we're going to pass the input. So this will be this was txt cost. That's our input, and we want to take the text from that. So now this line is creating a variable cost, which is of type float, and basically it's just taking in the input, which is our text cost dot text. So if we go to main storyboard, that's going to be basically any of the text that goes in this input here. Because we called it txt cost, we have it selected. Remember, the name down here is txt cost. And so that's why we're calling txt cost.text. It's just the text that's inputted there, and we're going to pass it to a float, because this function would not work very well if we gave it a string. So we'll do the same thing for the tip now. So we have a float, and we'll call this tip, and this will be again float pass, and we're going to have it pass the txt tip. And the great thing about working in this kind of an IDE in something like Xamarin Studio is that there is this autocomplete function. So you actually end up typing a lot less code. Alright, this is very good. We now have our cost and our tip, which are two inputs that the user inputs. So what do we want to do with them? Well, how do you calculate a tip? The tip is going to be, once we have the percentage of the tip, we're going to have to first convert it to a decimal rather than a percent. Then we're going to have to multiply it by the cost of the meal. So let's take this one step at a time. The first step will be the tip is the tip divided by 100. So this gives us the decimal representation of the tip. So for example, 45% would be changed to 0.45. Good. And now what do we want to do? So now the tip, the final tip, amount, in fact we could even create another variable if we wanted called tip amount, but just to avoid creating a ton of variables, I'm just going to call it tip still, and this is going to be whatever the tip is right now, which is the decimal representation of it. It's going to be that times the cost. That's not what we want. So now this is going to take the tip amount. Let's say we enter in 15%. It's going to divide it by 100, so we have 0.15. It's going to multiply by the cost, so we get the actual tip amount. This is going to be the monetary value of the tip that we're going to give. So now we have the final tip amount, but we're not looking to output that. We're looking to output the total cost. So that's going to be the final tip plus the cost of whatever it is we're buying, let's say a meal. So the cost, in fact, let's create another variable. Let's call this total cost, and we'll make it global. So we'll initialize it up here. Total cost. Okay, and the reason I initialize it up here is because then we can use it in multiple functions, whereas if I initialized it here, then we could only use it within the total cost, calculate total cost function. So we're going to say total cost is equal to the cost plus the final tip. Alright, so this is our calculate function now. It's taken in our cost and our tip inputs. It's converted the tip into a decimal, and it's figured out what the final tip amount will be. So this is the monetary value, not just the percentage. And then it's going to calculate the total cost of the meal, which will be the cost before the tip and the tip. Right, this is all well and good. We have the touch up inside function calling the call button function. The call button function will call the calculate total cost once it's pressed. So that's what this line is doing here, the button calculate.touchUpInside. And then that is going to call the calculate total cost function, which is going to take the input and figure out the tip and then calculate the total cost. Now we want to do it like we did before and just call some kind of a print function, which will be print total cost. We'll call this function. and again red because we haven't initialized it, but we'll do that now. So we're going to print total cost. Alright, so we have our function set up, and now all we need to do is reassign this label so it no longer says total cost, but it gives us the actual total cost. So now this is we're just going to reassign the text value. So this is in a label. This is going to be label total cost text. So this right here is just identifying that this is the text field of the label total cost. And we're going to change that to total cost, and this is we're going to change this into a string. The reason we change it into a string is because it doesn't like us inputting floats. It wants to have the text be a string variable rather than a float. And this is just changing the text field of that particular label. Alright, very good. So now to recap, we don't need to call the touch-up-inside handler in our viewDidLoad function. That was something that was unique to Android. So we have it called here. So this is basically if this button is touched, then do this. Call this one, which will call the calculate total cost function, which will calculate the total cost and print it. And that print function is basically just changing the text value of our label to display the total cost. In this part of the video, we implemented the main app functionality. So this is the part that actually performs the calculations once a button is pressed and prints out on the screen. So we implemented the button handlers and the calculate and print functions and had them all call each other in a good flow. So by now you should be able to implement basic functionality in these apps and design functions that will call other functions to perform some sort of a task.